From the hidden secrets of our backyards to the realities of the third world, we take a raw and real look into the challenges and the pursuits of social justice. Welcome to The Point.
The Point podcast is brought to you by LaPointe.life, offering healthcare, entrepreneurship, and education both domestically and internationally. Visit LaPointe.life to find out how you can get involved.
Growing up in an affluent life, he wanted what a lot of us grew up wanting, the picture-perfect life. Maybe a mansion, maybe a 6-salary income, maybe even a Ferari to drive. And as a corporate executive during the dot-com boom, he was well on his way to achieving this, until his life was completely altered by a trip to Asia. In fact, his life was so altered that he ended up choosing to live in a slum in Cambodia. During his time there, he wrote a book that was very influential to me called The Urban Halo. After that, he wrote a book called Subversive Jesus, and he's working on a new book that's about to come out called Subversive Missions. In fact, you can go online and get a free test to discover your missional type. Mine is the Catalyst, and I would love to hear what yours is. So this man that we're talking about is Craig Greenfield, and he describes himself as an outsider who helps insiders become alongsiders. In fact, Alongsiders actually became its own nonprofit called Alongsiders International. It is now reaching thousands of vulnerable children in 25 countries, including places in Asia, Africa, and Europe. Craig has been a massive influence to me over the last decade, and I can't wait for you to learn from him alongside with me. So please join me in welcoming Craig Greenfield. I think listeners, one of the first things they'll probably want to know is your accent. So you're from New Zealand.
Well, I was actually born in Canada, but I grew up in New Zealand. My family a New Zealand background. And I haven't lived in New Zealand for 20 years, so I've lost the edge of my New Zealand accent, but North Americans still pick it up.
Yeah, that's true. My family's from Minnesota, so whenever I get together with them, I suddenly get a Minnesotan accent, yes.
Right on.
But you had a unique childhood as well. Your parents, tell us about your parents' lifestyle that they chose and what you learned from that.
Yeah, my parents, I would say they didn't call it this, but they practiced radical hospitality, just welcoming in those who are not always welcome in society. So it was a lot of foster kids, a lot of kids with intellectual disabilities too, as well as refugees and folks who'd just gotten out of prison. And just, our house was always full. My mother was just a real hospitable person. And so that deeply impacted me. I was very introverted, just be, curled up in a corner, reading a book, minding my own business. Mm-hmm. But it just deeply impacted me because I just grew to love all kinds of people and they got me out of my shell. And it's been kind of a feature of my life ever since, is this call to practice radical hospitality and be a person of welcome.
Mm-hmm. And were they Christian, your parents?
Yeah, they were Christians. And in fact, my grandparents were missionaries. My parents were missionaries. And I ended up doing a lot of stuff overseas as well.
Yeah. And so your first trip, was it to Cambodia?
Yeah. So while I was a child, my parents actually welcomed 2 Cambodian refugees into our home. And that was pretty impactful because they had just escaped the Khmer Rouge. They had scars on their bodies. They were trying to tell us what they had been through. They couldn't speak English, so it was just through gestures and all of this.
Wow.
So that was really fascinating for me. And so when I was at university, I took 6 months off to go to Cambodia and just fell in love with the country, learnt the language. I wished I could go back to my childhood and speak Cambodian to my brother and sister, but fell in love with the country and especially with folks who were living in the slums there. And so I determined that I would go back and live in the slums and be amongst the people.
Mm-hmm. And why? No, but why?
Why? Yeah, that's pretty weird, isn't it?
But I think, my experience of in Haiti is we tried to be honest, make our life really as comfortable as possible, which was really still incredibly uncomfortable. Not always running water, definitely didn't have AC, definitely didn't have hot water, and not electricity was very scarce. But in order for our mental health, we tried to make it as, North American as possible. So what in you was like, I need to live in a slum?
It's a good question. I mean, there's probably all kinds of motivations and reasons in there. I guess as a follower of Jesus, I was reading the scriptures and Jesus just keeps talking about his, blessed are the poor. I've come to bring good news to the poor. And I had been impacted by some of the writings of Viv Gregg, the founder of Servants and Poor, and just really felt a sense of wanting to be inside and learn amongst those on the margins. And I was young and dumb as well. And so moved in there, but actually ended up spending about 15 years living in the slums in Cambodia up until last year. I'm not so young now and not so hardcore either. I mean, over the, those first 5 years, we had very little electricity. We had just an ice box for a fridge and we were just living in a tin shack. In fact, there was a power pylon through our bathroom and you would hear people clambering over our corrugated tin roof at night, just hooking up illegal connections to that power pylon. And, there was all kinds of shenanigans going on that was it was incredible to live in that way as long as we possibly could to get that kind of insight into what the lives of the urban poor are like. And that's informed everything I've done ever since.
In what year was that you first moved there?
That was the year 2000.
The year 2000, okay.
22 years ago.
I know, it blows my mind, right?
I know.
The other day, and it's 2002, and you're like, oh, yeah, okay. So you had met your wife already before you moved back, is that correct?
Yeah, so my wife had actually fled Cambodia as a refugee herself as a child. She lived through the Khmer Rouge years. And when she was turning about 5, her mother said, you're about to be sent into the fields to work, so we need to escape. So she managed to get together $20 and paid off a passing truck driver, fertilizer truck. And they got to the jungle and hiked through the jungle, past the landmines, past those who'd been blown up by the landmines, and then eventually got to New Zealand. But as a young child growing up, and also as a follower of Jesus, my wife had a sense of calling back to her own people. So when we met, it was kind of destined to be, I think. I was pretty sure the first time I met her, this would be a great person to get together with. And so we married and moved into the slums in Phnom Penh, the capital city, in the year 2000, beginning of 2000.
Wow. Well, walk us through, what was a normal, I know that normal is maybe a funny word to use, but what was an average day like during one of those 15 years?
I mean, my wife's more relational than I am. So she would be, hanging out with all the neighbors. And I do, of course, you're hanging out, you're getting to know people. But pretty soon we kind of got working on issues around HIV and AIDS. A lot of our neighbors were impacted by that. And then also being impacted by children being orphaned. And so we were working alongside an NGO called Servants, which I mentioned before. And they had quite a lot of medical work happening in the slums, as well as living in the slums themselves. Because we were not medical people, we focused on something that was related, which was the children being impacted and community-based care for those children. So we had originally thought of starting an orphanage, and then my research kind of led us to realize that's not the greatest idea.
Yeah.
How can we, rather than spending our money to take children out of their communities, how can we rally our resources to keep them within their extended families and within their communities so that they can be a part of that going forward? So that's what we did. And a lot of our time was spent working with local families and local churches, helping children that were being orphaned by AIDS in those early 2000s.
And is that how Alongsiders started?
That is how Alongsiders got started. Children were being cared for within families, but we recognized that the emotional and social needs, the spiritual needs were not always being met. And so we looked around and realized that the local church, full of young people, just had this amazing resource of young people who are passionate, young people who are filled with faith, are willing to do something to be a part of changing their world. What an amazing thing if we were to, invite them to make a simple but powerful commitment to walk alongside one child each.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a big brother or big sister, or as we call them, alongsiders. So that's where it began, and we quickly kind of shifted it to focusing on equipping those youth themselves to choose a child themselves.
Okay.
So go beyond those who had been orphaned by HIV or AIDS, just to make sure that we weren't re-stigmatizing.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the challenge, was for these young people to choose a child, a little brother or little sister themselves. And that's now spread beyond Cambodia into 25 countries. And there's about 16,000 children and youth involved in a multi-year journey that they're on.
Wow. That's powerful.
Yeah.
Does it ever feel unreal to you? Like, does it ever feel surreal? Or does it feel like, no, these were really hard things to do and you put in a lot of time and effort and you're like seeing fruit from it?
Yeah, I mean, anything of that size takes an incredible amount of just in study and learning and mistakes and practice and all of those types of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's God's grace that things have taken off. And we had to pivot a number of times. And, even the first few years of Alongsiders, we grew slowly. But over the last 18 months since COVID, we've seen that movement triple in size.
Wow.
And so it's partly a result of what's going on with COVID and partly a result of just some key changes that we made that have allowed that movement to really scale up.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us about what were some of the changes?
I mean, they weren't huge changes. It was just the way that we did our training. We made it more kind of grassroots and appropriate for Asia and Africa.
Okay.
We put in place some milestones to help people. All the movements are led and started by local leaders. So, there's alongsiders movements in countries that I've never been to.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's simply the model and the training, and we come alongside them as they start their own alongsiders movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so, giving them some roadmap milestones to work through, kind of injected some energy into things. And so when they have 50 alongsiders, they reach green mango stage. When they have 250 alongsiders, they reach yellow mango stage, which, a little bit of gamification can actually go quite far, because people want a sense of, okay, where do we go with this? What am I aiming for?
Yeah.
And so some of those just little tweaks can really make a big difference. Yeah.
That's cool. And you were living in Cambodia. You began implementing these programs that you saw fit for the community and the culture. But then there was a shift and you moved to North America.
Yeah. Strange, huh? Well, so it kind of happened in the middle of the journey. We'd been in the slums in Cambodia for 7 years, and we were evicted again. So we'd been evicted twice from slums.
What does it mean? Because I kept reading that and I don't understand it. So, like, how would you get evicted? People would decide that they needed the land for something else?
So what would happen is that some developer would go to local authorities and say, we'll give you $1 million for this land. Okay. Even though there's people legally living on it, legally owning the land. And so those local authorities who were corrupt would then go door to door and hand out official notices. You're evicted. You need to get off the land. And so you either comply or you don't comply, and the bulldozers come in and the soldiers come in. And
you lose that money, the money that you had been paying on the land or owning land?
We personally were just renting. So we were paying like $50 a month for a little shack. But a lot of people owned their shacks. So they had bought them for $1,000 or $2,000. And often the government will say, well, here's another piece of land way outside the city, or here's $500 or whatever.
Okay.
The second time, hadn't been through it as we had been through. We connected them in with the UN, and the UN was able to help them to rally together and get a much better settlement from the government. Okay. So we were being evicted that second time. And also alongsiders in Cambodia was being fully run by Cambodians. So it was kind of like the end of an era. And so we kind of began to pray and look around and sense that God was calling us somewhere else. And of all places, that road led to the inner city in Vancouver, Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so we moved in there, and that's a whole story in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I love the story and how honest you are in your writings about the hardships that came through it and how it's not all these glory days, and a lot of us who've worked in this space for any amount of time have had similar experiences where we come in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and excited about what might be happening, but there's really, really, really hard times, and you lose people along the way, and you can have spiritual warfare coming against you. Like, it really is okay. Like, are we really going to dig in and go forward with what we believe is right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's where we find our sense of meaning and purpose in life, isn't it? When we go through struggles towards something that's worthwhile. If we're just cruising along as comfortable as possible, pursuing our own happiness, sooner or later we realize there's no meaning in this. There's no meaning.
Yeah.
And so those sacrifices and struggles along the way, for some strange reason that is paradoxical, kind of lay the foundations of a meaningful life.
Yeah. Wow. That's so well said. Again, I just love the story. But give us the brief of, like, you showed up in Vancouver and you were realizing that there were institutions that were existing in the city, but they were lacking long-term output. Like, people were just getting meals all the time, but things were not changing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we're very interested as followers of Jesus in what Jesus talks about as the good news. But to know what that is, we need to understand what's the bad news first. And so when we first arrived, me and another guy who was going to be part of our community just spent a bit of time living on the streets of downtown Eastside Vancouver as homeless men, just to understand a little bit about what that would be like. Mm-hmm. And we realized, like, people are just walking by us as if we don't exist. We're being completely ignored. We're isolated. We line up in these soup kitchen lines, and there's just such a pervading sense of isolation and loneliness for the men and women living on the streets there. That was certainly bad news. So, of course, if that's the bad news, then perhaps the good news is to be welcomed. Again, this kind of come full circle, is to be welcomed into family, into home, and so we just started living together, a number of us, in homes that were kind of, our rule was, close enough that you could walk in your pajamas to each other's house, or carrying a heavy casserole. That's how far apart we might live.
Yeah.
And so we lived in these interconnected homes, what we called an intentional Christian community. And just our motto for dinner every night was invite too many people, cook too much food. And so we would have upwards of 40 people a night around the dinner table. And it was just a family meal, right? Not a soup kitchen, not a line. I would make an announcement each night. If this is your first night, you're our guest. If you've been here more than once, you're part of the family, and that means helping with the dishes afterwards. Right. So just kind of creating a sense of family and community and welcoming. People were just deeply moved to be sat around a dinner table with a family, some of them for the first time in 20 years.
Yeah.
And to be with my kids who were sitting right there alongside them and, just being kids. It was just we take it for granted, don't we, when we have family? But when you're outside in the cold and wet, gosh, that's something powerful.
Yeah. I've been thinking so much about that idea after reading the book of, like, wait, why is it more of like a radical idea to just hang out with people, to just like have dinner with people? And we've created, like these institutions to fulfill what we think the need or the whole is, which is like food, clothing, kind of some of those basic needs, which are needed, but in a different way. And I also love how you talk about how, you felt conflicted about having the kids in that environment, but you were able to show the kids that even as children, they can have an impact on the environment around them. I thought that was powerful. Tell us a bit about the kids on the block.
Yeah. So you'd walk down the street, East Hastings Street, if you've ever been there. I mean, it's just full on open drug use, people smoking crack pipes, shooting up fighting whatever's going on. So you walk down the street, though, and there's a deep respect for the vulnerability of children. And there's not many children in that neighborhood. So on each block, as soon as you kind of cross the street, someone would shout out, "Kids on the block." And everyone would put away their crack pipes and, put away their needles. And remember one day we're walking down there, "Kids on the block." And we get to this next block and no one noticed us. And there was a bit of a scuffle going on. They were kind of pushing and shoving each other and fighting and swearing. And suddenly one guy turns around and he sees the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so he turns back to the others that he's fighting, gives them a big shove and says, "Shut the up, man. Can't you see there's kids on the block?"
I love it.
So it's just this amazing rawness and just power about vulnerability.
Yeah.
And, to me, as someone who wants to see the world through the eyes of Jesus, I just see the upside down kingdom in that, right? Like the police couldn't get anybody to put their crack pipes away.
Yeah.
But my children could have that kind of impact. That was cool. I mean, they wouldn't have that now. My kids are bigger than me, especially my son. He's built like a tree trunk, but
I love it. That's amazing. So your kids, are they ever, like, now that they're older and they've processed a lot of this, have they ever been resentful of not being able to have a more affluent life?
Not that they've said to me. I mean, they also just kind of live their lives.
Yeah.
Like my daughter is a huge K-pop fan.
That's so cool. Yeah.
She's just, we're in New Zealand this year where she finishes her last year of high school. And, she's just living her best Asian life, eating ramen every day.
So cool. Yeah.
Watching K-dramas, listening to K-pop, and she just thinks she's still in Asia.
I love it.
Yeah, they've never expressed any resentment.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like I grew up in a similar way, right?
Yeah.
And I just think it just gives you a perspective on life. If anything, it can make you a little bit cynical of the Western world and the priorities that they see around them.
Yeah.
It gives them a sense of, wow, people are whack. People are confused.
Yeah. My husband, he always, he grew up in Haiti, and he always calls it like, "Oh, you were just in your little American bubble. Like, you didn't," he says, "I didn't live real life. You didn't have real life." I would say something like, "Well, I lost a goldfish when I was 7 years old. That was pretty traumatizing." And he just rolls his eyes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm an advocate for us getting out of our bubbles. I think there's a real paralysis in social justice circles these days around, and I include myself in social justice circles, there's a paralysis about being a part of the global, being a part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
None of us want to be white saviors.
Mm-hmm.
None of us want to go stomping around the world in ignorant ways. We recognize that missions has a history of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
But that can lead to a complete paralysis, which is also not good. Because then we lose our perspective. We're still immersed in our middle-class suburbs, and we have completely lost our perspective of what's important in the world.
Yeah, that's great. So what do we do? What do we do with that?
Well, that's why I wrote my next book. Funnily, you should ask.
Good. We need it.
Yeah. So Subversive Jesus was my last one about our years in inner city Vancouver. But Subversive Mission is about what's our role in the world? And is there a healthy way to be outsiders in a world of need? What does it look like when we go with all the power and privilege and resources that we have into places of poverty? And how do we avoid being white saviors or saviors of any color?
Yeah.
And so basically the book is a framework for that, a new way of thinking about that. And so 5 different ways of being in the world according to our gifting and calling.
Cool.
And then I alternate that with the 5 kind of most common blind spots that Westerners come with into cross-cultural settings.
Oh, I love that. And the book is not out yet, right? But you can pre-order it?
Yeah, pre-order. It's out November 1st. So depending on when you're listening to this podcast, it may well be available.
That's great. What about your mental health? Because I know when you work in this field, and you personally have experienced cancer, you've experienced your own hardships as well.
Yeah.
claustrophobia, etc. So
Yeah.
I know when you're working in any environment, if you're in a bank, if you work at Starbucks, whatever, there's daily stressors, right? And when you're working in messy situations, it can be even harder because you're surrounded in an environment that doesn't let you take a step away, right? Like, so you're living in
Yeah.
the slum, you're hearing the gunshots every night. Every time, you open your door, you're combated with different visual things that can, have trauma triggers, impacts.
Mm.
How have you kept yourself healthy during the years?
A lot of alcohol. No, there's rhythms that are helpful, rhythms of Sabbath, rhythms of time away.
Yeah.
I haven't always been healthy, and
Mm-hmm.
perhaps developing claustrophobia partway through this all is a telling sign.
Yeah.
I hate to get on airplanes.
Yeah. That made me feel better.
I never get in
I
elevators.
actually have that too. Yeah. And you fly everywhere. You like live on islands. Like, so yeah.
Yeah. So, I think it's taken a toll. But on the flip side of that, I do believe if you're doing what you're gifted to do and what you love doing,
Yeah.
and that's part of, writing this book, is showing that there's so many different ways to be in the world and be a person who serves in the world.
Yeah.
If you're doing something that's just so in line with what God's gifted you to do and be.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I believe God's just gifted me to be a social entrepreneur, someone who is a part of starting and birthing new initiatives that benefit the poor.
So cool.
And I just love doing it. It sets me on fire. I just love it. And so I'm doing something that is awesome, that is just really enjoyable. So, it gives me energy.
That's a good way to think about it, right? Because you have to work no matter what you're doing. So you might as well be taking the good and the bad.
Might as well be doing something that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose and is in line with your calling and is making a difference for the vulnerable in the world.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines too, is there a story either of somebody that you know or you yourself that you go back to that helps you keep going when you do feel like you're defeated?
There's lots of stories, and especially when I am called on to suffer or sacrifice in some way. I've been evicted from slums, and many of our friends, of course, have gone through that. I remember one of the women that we know, she was being evicted from a slum, and her and some of the other women in that slum. And so they took their beds and put them into the middle of the busiest intersection in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Mm-hmm. If you can just imagine, like just a massive traffic jam. They said, we have nowhere to lay our heads, so we're just going to put our beds right here. And of course, they're immediately arrested and within 24 hours sentenced to a year in jail.
Wow.
And so, when I think about what I'm facing, I think about people like that. And I think, that woman is a prophet.
Wow.
And how can I amplify her voice? How can I amplify her situation into the world so that people know? And how can I be in solidarity with her? And that kind of helps me overcome the little things that are like, oh, why don't I have my favorite chocolate here in Cambodia?
But sometimes it's the chocolate that will get you through the day.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone's bringing chocolate in, I'm eating it.
Right. Well, I have loved all the books. I can't wait for the next one to come out. From this conversation or from your extensive history, is there anything you'd want listeners to take with them today?
I guess that, we're at a kind of a pivotal time in history with, COVID and the sense of, what we can be part of doing in the world. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of folks who are kind of like, well, maybe I just batten down the hatches and, build the castle walls and put a moat around me. Mm-hmm. But I think that is not the pathway to a meaningful life. And neither is go into all the world with a flag and be triumphalistic and all of that and ignorance. I don't think that's the way either. But perhaps there's another way. Mm-hmm. And so, that would be my invitation, is to explore the third way of being in the world as an alongsider, as someone who is a part of doing things that make a difference and are worthwhile.
That's so good. And if someone's listening to this today, they want to get involved, what are the best ways to start that process?
go to my website, craiggreenfield.com, and you can actually do a 5 missional types quiz on there. Find out what your type is, like what's your sense of calling or gifting to be in the world.
Yes.
And that'll set you up for reading my next book, Subversive Mission, or just grab that book, of course. And explore how you might be uniquely gifted to be in the world, as well as, become more self-aware around some of the blind spots.
Mm-hmm. So cool. I love it. I can't wait for it. A special thank you to Craig and his publishing company for connecting with us at La Pointe. You can find all of the links in the show notes at lapointe.life. You can also connect with Craig directly at craiggreenfield.com, and don't forget to go online and discover your missional type at craiggreenfield.com as well. Thank you again for joining us. We'd love to hear any feedback. You can email me directly at callie@lapointefoundation.org, or find us on Instagram as well at lapointe.life. Until next time, keep on fighting for justice.